Good evening, and welcome to our Sunday night live chat. I'm Doug Warner, and I'll be here with you for the next hour. We're going to have a very interesting topic this evening. I just want to remind you up front that I would really appreciate it if you participated, you chatted in with your questions or comments as we go through. You're not going to be interrupting me at any point. In fact, if you want to take a little tangent on the topic, feel free to do that. So tonight's topic that I'd like to talk about is building a blueprint for character. Character is a word that we talk about a lot, good character, bad character. But really, what does that mean? What does it mean to have a good character? And what are the components? How do we develop it? Light one off. Okay, so I'm going to start with a premise. And my premise is that circumstances reveal our character. They don't determine it. Character is something that needs to be formed, that needs to be built. And character is not so much formed in the big dramatic times of life, but rather that's what character manifests itself. Character is really formed in those daily applications of certain principles in our daily life. Those little decisions we make. My premise is that Okay. So, what is character? My definition of character is it's a pattern. It's a pattern of interaction with others and interaction with ourselves. How we treat others, how we treat ourselves. This pattern of interactions is what I'm going to call that container we call character. The other component of what character is this ability to choose a right action, to choose the appropriate action at the right time. All right, so how do we build that character? How do we do that? I think building our character is really a process. And that process has two parts, maybe three parts actually tonight. First part is we need a list. We need some sort of agreed upon list of what are good character traits. And it needs to be agreed upon. It needs to be agreed upon by the majority of the people in our culture to make it work. We need a process for teaching and for learning these character traits. We need character education. And we also need a way to practically apply these principles in our daily lives. We need to understand how to take it from the classroom, if you will, into your daily life. So this is the process of character building. And one's going to ask, well, who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for building character? Who's responsible for teaching it? Who's in charge of this? Well, we can look to a number of components. We can look at family. We can look at our religion. We can look at our peers. We can look at our education system. All of these places inform us of what those character traits are. But we start to see that there can be mixed signals. Not everybody is on the same page here. Not all the elements that would be informing us, especially as children, growing as we're maturing, not informing us consistently what makes a good person, what makes a good sound character. So one of the things that I had to ask is what makes good character? Why is it so important? Why is having this good character so important? Rob, what do you think? Why is it important to have a good character?
I mean, it guides us in so many different parts of our lives that it's, I think, necessary for us to be able to navigate all these different things.
I think it does. It's how we navigate It's how we navigate our lives. Sometimes people have referred to this as our moral compass, if you will. It's important, I think, more than anything, to start to have a handle on and give a lot of attention to building that character, because it helps us realize our full potential as a human being. Our full potential is not going to be realized if we're off balance, or we're not working on this very important part of ourselves, that who we are in this human existence. The other reason that building a good character, I think, is important is because it determines how we interact with others, the world. Not just the human element of the world, but all of the world. How do we interact with our planet? How do we interact with our environment? All life forms. It's all about relationships, and how our character, the nature of our character, is going to determine the effectiveness and the quality of those relationships. I remember Rob and I had a discussion the other day about talking about character and examples of good character or admirable character. And we discussed this idea of the greatest generation. Some of you may be familiar with that term. They're referring to the generation that fought World War II. It would be my father's generation. My father was in the Marine Corps in World War II. And they were called or labeled the greatest generation because of the character traits that were revealed by this incredibly dramatic and significant aspect of history, World War II. And they shined. As a generation, they shined. They stepped up to the plate. They did what they had to do, all these kinds of things. But it wasn't the war that created that character. The character of those individuals at that time had been formed in the crucible of the Depression. I remember my dad talking about, he was born in, I think, 1924. So he was growing up in those very formative years in the middle of the Depression in Missouri on a farm. And when you hear about those times and how the folks that lived at that time through that situation, the Depression, it formed their character. So when the war came up and they got thrust into the war, they had that sense of solid, admirable character already formed. Now, of course, it isn't every single person, but across the board, this is a generation that's been defined as being great. And it was great because life and their culture at that time had helped build that character that then burst on stage in the middle of the war. So what are these character traits that we're talking about? There's a lot of them, and I tried to default to some of the character traits. There's a lot of things that come to mind. What's a character trait that you would come to mind for you, Rob? A good character trait?
Honesty.
Honesty. I think across the board, at least on paper, at least when you're sitting across the table from someone, they would agree, some level of honesty is a character trait, is a positive character trait. Other things like respect or fortitude, integrity, these are all words. Self-control, appropriate discipline. These are all some of those traits that I think we would agree upon. So we're looking for a pathway. We're looking for how do we formulate this process, this pathway to create character. Now, for some of us, different generations that I'm speaking to tonight, my generation, we grew up in a certain time, place in history, and our characters were formed for the good or the bad, or if you will, or for the balance or the imbalance, depending on how we were educated. I know that there's some talk, there's some opinion that, oh, a younger generation may not have as strong a character as we do. Let's remember this, is that the older generation is always looking down its nose, maybe not to a person, but collectively at the younger generation, thinking that, oh, you don't know how hard it is. You know, I had to walk to school uphill both ways and 6 miles or whatever. We tend to not recognize what is building the character of the younger generations. And this is sort of a consistent problem. I know when I was growing up, I had the same view of my parents. But I do think that we're in a particular time and place in history where we lack a consistent process. We lack character building. It's not at the top of the list of important things. So in order to start to put together a system or a process for this character building, I want to work off of a couple of premises here. First of all, the only thing we control are our actions. We don't control other people, we don't control their minds, we don't control their thoughts, we don't control the outcomes of things, but we do control our actions. And it's through our actions that our character is manifested. We can talk a good talk. We can say, yes, I believe in all of these traits and I'm going to work towards them. But when the pedal hits the metal, how do you respond? And your response is how you're manifesting your character, the status of your character. So working with this idea, another premise that I'd like to pose is that the human condition, as humans, we are composed of two general aspects. First aspect is our ego self, or our ego identity. And that ego identity is our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies, the part of us that navigates the world on a daily basis. The other aspect of us, working at the same time simultaneously, is what we call the authentic self, or I prefer the objective observer. Now, the ego self, being our thoughts, our emotions, the status of our bodies, we can see that that's in constant flux. It's always changing. On the other hand, the objective observer is always steady. And what we need to do with this understanding of these two components, they work hand in hand as if they were two sides of the same coin. We're looking to seek balance, to create a healthy ego self, a healthy body, a healthy mindset, a healthy range of emotions in the ego self, but also create a range of motion for us to be able to sit back, objectively observe ourselves, sit back and be able to look at our thoughts. There's me being angry, or there's me again being resentful or judgmental or what have you. So this fluidity of working your day-to-day life in that ego self with a balanced thought and emotional pattern, but also the ability to sit back as needed and observe. I think the word conscience comes to mind when I think of that ego self. I think it's a word we use. My conscience wouldn't let me do it. I was about ready to do or say something, but there was that little voice inside of me that said, Doug, don't do it. That's actually ourselves connecting with the authentic self, the observer, and assessing. That just demonstrates that we're stepping back and able to assess how we're supposed to do in that situation or what we're supposed to do. How's that music?
It's coming through. There's
Yep.
nothing we can do about it.
We've got a little, if you were all with us last week, was it last week we had a party? We had 2 parties. Okay, so this is a party central, our underground studio here in St. Petersburg. We thought it was well hidden, but there seems to be a party here. every Sunday. So enjoy the music. So anyway, so we have these two components, back to what we were talking about. We have these two components of ourselves, the ego self and the authentic self. Part of our process to build our character is to work with those two ideas. And as I said, what's our problem? What's the problem? What's getting in our way? Why don't we have this process in place? As I said, I think our culture has, at this point in time, has failed us in a lot of ways. It's not priority to build character. It's not priority to teach children, teach young adults, and throughout the various stages of life, what it means to have a balanced, in quotes, good or healthy character. In school, too much on performance, on grades, on standardized testing, or whatever you want to, whatever it is. Making sure that you're training people to get a job, but we're not training people to be people. We're not training people to be balanced, healthy human beings. They can come out of school with a great toolbox to get a paying job, but they may have not developed their character in any way sufficiently. I think this has done some damage to our sense of ourselves and our ability to interact with others. I think that becomes manifest. We see across the world right now, statistics are showing high levels of stress in certain populations, especially younger people. It is very, very disturbing. There's a high suicide rate. Substance abuse, all these things become manifestations that it is in fact a stress. It's a form of stress. It is stress, but it also can be looked at as a reflection of people adrift, not a strong foundation of how to handle life, not a set of principles that are consistent, that are taught, that are tested, and not a consistent set of people to fall back on to get guidance and to go to throughout these stages in life. Am I doing it right? You know, is my character up to snuff, so to speak? It leaves us disconnected, fragmented, disconnected from ourselves, disconnected from each other, and not whole, not complete. Once again, remember this, character building is part of us manifesting or learning to manifest our full potential as humans. We can't even agree on a list of character traits, good character traits. You know, we got people go to church on Sunday or Saturday, they go to service on Saturday or Friday night or whatever the religion is, and they're given a set of moral directives. But they step into the office or school or what have you the next day, Monday or what have you, and now they're working in another field, a completely sometimes opposite field of moral directives. You know, on Saturday or Sunday, they're told not to harm each other. But they go to work and they're harming themselves, they're pushing themselves past edge, and ultimately they end up harming others. We're told not to lie in our wisdom traditions, but our culture doesn't always reinforce that. In fact, sometimes we're rewarded for conning the other guy into believing something. Lying has not necessarily been touted as a bad thing culturally. We can just listen to the news of the day. I don't think I need to go any further with that. Truth-telling is great for the pulpit on Sunday, but truth-telling doesn't seem to make the cut on Monday morning in the business world or in the government office. The other part is that when we're given whatever we're given as far as these traits, we're not given a process. We're not given a process to learn these, not a process to examine ourselves. Are we doing it right? And a process to how do I display this in my daily living? We're not taught how to balance the ego self. We're not taught how to access the authentic self. We're not even taught that they exist as two aspects of who we are. Very often we're not taught that. And probably worst of all, we're not given adequate role models. It seems that so often, so unfortunately, the people that rise to the top, whether it's in a business environment, a religious environment, a government environment, are not those who display the most admirable character traits. How does that happen? That happens because of all the things I've just mentioned. We lack consistency, cohesiveness, coherent list of traits that we all can agree on to some degree. We lack a process. We lack a teaching method. We lack teachers to teach it.
Is that the reason that maybe Gandhi is so popular as a leader? I mean, he was never elected necessarily, but he led the country, freed the country, and he displayed those character traits that are timeless.
Absolutely. I think when we look back at someone like Mahatma Gandhi, Rob was just mentioning, as being an example of a rarity, at least a rarity in the 20th century, coming into the 21st century, of a leader, someone who actually was an attorney to start with. Mahatma Gandhi was an attorney, but he got over it, and he became a moral leader, not as a religious leader, but as he politicized himself, he brought with him a moral fiber, a moral code, an already developed, solid, in quotes, good character. And he carried that into politics, and he didn't compromise. He didn't compromise those character traits as he moved into an arena of affairs where those character traits were either compromised daily or they were non-existent. And so he rose to the top, sort of like the lotus flower floating on top of muddy water, unsullied. No one's perfect. I'm not putting Gandhi up as being a perfect person, but he stands out. Why? He stands out because he had a developed character, of good character, and we're going to talk about where that came from, because that came from yoga. Actually, it came from the philosophy of yoga, and that's a place that I teach from. I spent years studying and teaching yoga, and some of the things that I'm putting out here in this channel, a lot of the things I'm putting out here in this channel, come from that source, but not exclusively. What yoga is teaching, what Gandhi was portraying, was reflecting his character, are really the values that span all the wisdom traditions of the world. We have other icons throughout my lifetime. We think of characters who have stood out. It's not just being a great general, or it's not just being a great, lawmaker, but the people that we admire, unfortunately, many of them seem to get themselves killed early, which may be some reflection on the friction they have with the culture. You think of Martin Luther King. You think of the Kennedy brothers, Jack and Robert, who were assassinated. Not perfect people, none of us are, but they displayed a certain character, a grace under fire, grace under pressure, as Hemingway would say, which is courage. But they had that presence of character. So I'm looking at a solution here. How do we solve the problem? The problem is inconsistency. The problem is lack of teaching, lack of process, lack of teachers. Our culture seems to have mixed signals all the time. In fact, most of these moral codes or what have you that say make a good character, the average person say, well, that's all good and fine, Doug, but that's not going to work in the real world. But actually they do. So the solution I'm offering is a sequence process to teach, to learn how to build character, that explains those basic traits, tells you how to identify them, how to grow them, how to polish them, and how to apply them to daily life. How to create a healthy ego self, how to create a range of motion to connect with the objective observer, or your conscience. How to develop that sense of conscience. Can I step back and make an appropriate assessment in this situation? Can I look at my thoughts and my emotions and my reactions and determine right action? Because the authentic self that we've talked about a few times now is the place that is always constant, it's not in flux, and it's where we go for wisdom, for discernment, and it's where we go for compassion. Going back to Gandhi for a moment. Gandhi's guiding, as I had mentioned, Gandhi's guiding principles came out of the yoga tradition. And in the yoga tradition, I'll give you some examples of some of these character traits, these positive character traits that he exhibited and lived by. These are the same character traits that I have studied, and I don't claim to be living by them to the degree as anyone else has, but it is what I try to work with for my own life, and it is what I teach. And these traits, we have a list of them. Now in the yoga tradition, they're called the yamas and niyamas. Now that's Sanskrit words, but in reality, they're moral guidelines, universal ethics, if you will. But I like to identify them as character traits. I like to identify them as character traits. If we look at them as character traits, then we have a list of what we need to do. These 10 things, this is a good place to start. You know, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have 10 commandments. But there's a lot of controversy over the applicability of those 10 commandments. I'm not saying they're wrong in any way whatsoever, but that was an attempt at one time in history to lay out character building. What's a person of good moral fiber, if you will, or strong character look like? They follow these things. But I'm going to offer some ideas that come from this yoga tradition that we talked about, that Gandhi lived by. And we're going to talk just for a few moments about not just how to do something. It's not just a do this and don't do that. It's not thou shalt or thou shalt not. It's an idea and then a process of explaining that idea and showing you how to apply it in your daily life. So let's go with one that's probably very familiar with many of you out there. And it's this idea of doing less harm. Doing the best we can to just not harm other people, not harm ourselves. To do no harm. And this is a guideline that runs pretty much through all the wisdom traditions, even into our modern medical guidelines. First thing is to do no harm. Now, we can't be 100% with that, but we can move in the direction of doing less harm. So a person of strong character, one of the guidelines, one of the traits that I'll offer to you as being a trait of good character is one who is moving towards doing less harm. The first place that we work with that is, of course, ourselves. Can I do less harm to myself? Remember that our character traits are manifested by our actions. So this is a doing practice, folks. This is not just listening and reading and listening to a sermon, or it's not just listening to me on this YouTube channel. This is about taking some of these ideas and going out and using them in real life. How could I do myself less harm? Rob, how have you worked with doing less harm to yourself?
I've worked with, I guess, trying to keep my mouth shut when I should, or when I think I should, or when I remember to, so to speak.
Okay, so a little mindfulness in speech idea is, so what kind of harm, self-harm would you have caused by speaking the wrong thing at the wrong time?
Well, I think it's pretty easy to offend people with what we say. And I had a conversation this week with someone, and I kind of knew some things about their relationship, and I kind of knew this other person's partner, and something slipped out of my mouth, and I was like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. That's not my place to say these types of things. And it was okay, and it worked out, and it wasn't too bad, but it could have been. I recognize, looking back on it now, that it wasn't my place to say that, and I should have recognized that beforehand.
Okay. So again, real life example. We go into it, and we go into our daily lives. We go into interactions with other people, and we find that we have to modify our behavior. How is what I'm about to do or say, is it going to cause harm? Am I about ready to say something or do something that's going to harm me, or is it going to harm someone else? So that person of strong character would be constantly alert, constantly aware that this is important to not cause harm to myself. How do I cause harm to myself? Many of us out there, many of you out there, and I know myself, have done this through caustic self-talk, or judging ourselves, or putting ourselves down, negative self-talk. Or we have hurt ourselves by not feeling we're good enough, comparing ourselves to others. We should be. I should be this. I should be that. These are all ways we hurt ourselves. These are ways that we can diminish the strength of our character. I think when we say do less harm, it's pretty easy to think about, well, I shouldn't hurt other people, or maybe not hurt animals, or what have you. Might even have the ability, the range of motion to say, I shouldn't hurt the planet. But we seem to overlook the first step, and that is not to harm ourselves. Another category, another trait of someone with good character, in my opinion, and again coming from that yoga tradition, is to just do a little less lying, a little more truth-telling. Where do we lie? I mean, we see pretty obvious that we shouldn't lie to other people, although that becomes very gray and fuzzy when you're trying to sell people something or you're trying to market. We see it every day, shades of gray there. But also the first place we practice our character building is lying to ourselves. How do we lie to ourselves? Telling ourselves stories about ourselves, to ourselves. What kind of people we say we are to ourselves. We mask our true actions. Lying to other people. There's a difference between truth and honesty. We were discussing the other day, I'll give you a little story. When I was in kindergarten, first day of kindergarten, Catholic school, I come home. My mom says, well, Doug, how did it go today at school? I said, Mom, somebody got in trouble for talking, and they had to stand behind the piano with tape on their mouths. And she was like, oh my gosh, well, who was it? I said, Mom, I don't know everybody's name. So about a half hour later, I hear, Douglas Andrew. And so that's when I knew I was in trouble. And one of my friends ratted me out. Of course, it was me. I was the first one. I was the one who got the tape on their mouths. I was the one behind the piano for talking. And so what's that have to do with honesty and truth? Well, I told the truth. Someone did stand behind the piano, and I don't know everybody's name, but I wasn't completely honest. And somehow I came up with that at 5 years old and probably disturbed my parents a bit. I probably should be disturbed myself. But these are ways that we feel like we can navigate truth and honesty. I was able to tell a little lie, but I did it by not telling the whole truth. I gave a version of the truth. Uh, we do this a lot, or we justify it. So truth telling, honesty is one of we mentioned earlier in this talk tonight as being one of those universally accepted character, good character. Someone of good character doesn't lie, but we often bend the truth, as I gave you an example. We distort it a little bit, or if nothing else, we often will lie to ourselves of where we are. Yeah, I can do that. I can take that. When you really know it's going to damage you. These are ways we lie to ourselves. Another category that's fairly universal, that's part of this character building blueprint from the yoga tradition, but it's also universal, I think, is this idea of stealing. And across the board, it's fairly accepted that we shouldn't steal. We shouldn't steal from other people. But again, we find ourselves stealing from ourselves. We steal opportunities. We rob ourselves of opportunities for friendships, for relationships, maybe by holding on to our anger, our resentment, holding grudges, not letting go. We rob ourselves of our health by, go back to number one, how do we hurt ourselves? I may be over exercising or overworking and harming myself, robbing myself of my own health, my own time, giving past my edge, giving till I get angry and resentful. And these are ways that we are actually stealing from ourselves. And I think this is a pretty big one. These top three, harming, stealing, and lying, I think you're going to find in almost every tradition. But what they don't always teach you is the first place you have to learn on a daily practice to learn how to not hurt yourself first, not steal from yourself first, not lie to yourself first. And that's the hardest one. That's usually the hardest one to be aware of. So these are ways we take these into the street. Another one of these character building or character traits rather that I think is very important, again universally accepted, is we call it discipline or stick-to-itness or fortitude, or even call it grit. That's a great word, that grit. But what does that really mean? What does that mean? Discipline for many people means no pain, no gain. But in reality, that's just another way to beat yourself up for the most part. So the person who's trying to build that balanced character, that foundation, looks for appropriate discipline, doing enough to promote growth, but not crossing your edge, not using it as a tool to self-flagellate, to break yourself down. What is appropriate discipline? It's not self-abuse. We so often equate the discipline, being a disciplined person. I'm a disciplined person. That's a great character trait. It's not if you're hurting yourself all the time. If you're just beating yourself up, or you're setting up expectations that I did this, you should do that. And that so often happens between parents and children. We use this discipline to harden us. Oh, we think that's going to make us hard. It's going to make us tough. It has a tendency, if it's past edge, if it's too much, if it's too caustic, it makes you brittle. It doesn't keep you flexible. Which also brings to mind an idea here of this discipline and fortitude. I talk with a lot of folks work with a lot of folks in this age group we call the millennials. And one of the things, actually, my son is in this age group, and he and I have had numerous discussions about these things. And one of the things is what's appropriate discipline, this fortitude, developing this strength of character. In one of the things that he and I had done when he was 15 is we went on a pilgrimage to Spain. We walked across Spain 500 miles. And we had trained for it. And it was something that was hard. Clearly not impossible, but it was hard. And it was definitely hard for a 15-year-old. And we did it in 30 days. It was an appropriate challenge where he had to step up and employ self-discipline to forge that just the right amount of inertia, just the right amount of pushing himself, but not to the point of getting hurt, not to the point of self-abuse. And I had to learn the same thing. It was an exercise for me too. I learned a lot of things in that experience along these lines. So these are some of the ideas of some of these character traits. Now, what I want to do at this point is not go through every single character trait that I teach, but I'm giving you some examples. Because on this channel, if you haven't already researched this or found these, 4 days of the week, I release a short video. And these videos come out at, what do they come about? 7 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And these short videos are highlighting many of these character traits. And so you watch those videos and you get an idea of some of the other character traits, how can we build our character. So by watching the channel alone, you can start to build one of the components of that process, a list of character traits. These seem to work. Here's what they are. Here's how to start learning them, how to apply them in daily life. The other part of what I'm offering here, and we want to talk about, is we have that list of traits, is, okay, so where's the process? How do I go about balancing that ego self? How do I go about connecting with my conscience and my authentic self, as I called it? I also, on this channel, as you may be aware, is I teach the 4-step path. Now, path is simply it's a framework I created. It's 4 sequential steps: pause, assess, take action, and heal. It is derived out of some from yoga and some from this broader wisdom tradition pool that all these cultures in the world have agreed upon. And these steps do just that. It teaches you how to balance, create a healthy ego self, how to navigate your thoughts and emotions, how to focus, how to concentrate, how to also step back and connect with that authentic self, that observer part of you, your conscience, and have that range of motion. It also employs and uses as a foundation these character traits of the yoga tradition. Again, these are character traits I think are agreed upon across the world. So the 4-step path is also, there are numerous videos on this channel. I really encourage you to go out and after this chat is to go to the channel, cruise through, take a look at those videos, comment if you would, like it, share it, do all those YouTube things that we all love and keeps this channel running. But we can have further conversations, as we will, on those topics. So Rob, you're always good at giving me a counterpoint. Counterpoint. What do you got for me?
What about consciousness?
Consciousness and character. Maybe I shouldn't have asked Rob that question. No, actually, that's a great question, Rob. What's that word consciousness? How does consciousness, not to be confused with conscience, but consciousness, how does that play into this whole character building process. Primarily, it's understanding and accepting and starting to build experience with navigating these various aspects or levels of consciousness. When we are fully functioning in our waking state with our thoughts and our emotions, our bodies, we're doing our daily job, we're working out of that ego self, if you will. We're being a functional human being. We're working out of a certain level of consciousness, that ego consciousness, if you will. But there's another level of consciousness that we have access to on a regular basis. And that's the one where we sit back in the director's chair, if you will, of the authentic self, of the observer. And that is a level of awareness or a level of consciousness that takes us out of the bubble of the ego self, out of the bubble of reactiveness, and just allows us to look at ourselves from outside the bubble, looking in. So we have those two levels of consciousness. In fact, the old yogis identified these three levels of consciousness, if you will. Two of them are very similar. One's the waking state. One is the dream sleep state, where we're in a dream, we're asleep, but we're still on. The ego self, the ego identity is still in full play. And you've all had dreams, and you know very well that what happens in the dream will affect the body. If you get stressed or afraid or feeling pain in a dream, it directly correlates to a physical reaction. So you're really still in this ego shell, this ego bubble, ego self bubble, if you will, whether you're asleep and dreaming or you're awake. But there's another level of consciousness that they identified, and that's the third level, which is the sleep dreamless, or I should say, dreamless sleep state. And it's said that in that state where we're in a deep sleep and we're not dreaming, we've sort of detached our awareness from the ego self, from the body, from the thoughts, from the emotions. And our consciousness then merges into that state of awareness of the observer or the conscience. And there are practices in yoga, there are meditation practices for this. This is one of the large directions, if not the direction, of these meditation practices as you find them in yoga, is to be able to, at will, detach yourself from the effects, from the fluctuations of the ego self, and then work and be aware, but with awareness, connect with the authentic self. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, so it's about being self-aware. Self-aware of I'm aware that there's this part of me, the ego self, and I'm also aware that there's other part of me, and I can float between them. My awareness, my consciousness can float between them to do what I need to do.
I see that. I guess just making that transition to float between them, that's the tough part.
It is the tough part, and this is why these practices, again, I teach them in this 4-step path process, but I didn't create those processes. I simply put them into a framework that I teach from. But that is a big part of creating this character. In order to choose to do right action at any point, which just to review back to the beginning of this talk tonight, having a balanced good character is the ability to choose right action. What's the most appropriate response to life right now? I said response, not so much reaction. What should I do now? And the way we make that determination is by being able to float between the two. Now, between the ego awareness, ego self-awareness, or the authentic self. Now, the example I used the other day is if I've got a screw to put into the wall, and I have to determine is it a flathead or a Phillips screwdriver, I don't need to sit back in the objective observer and go through that. I can say, yeah, I mean, my awareness, my consciousness here, the ego self says, choose a flathead and do it. But when I have a bigger question. Oh, I have this chronic resentment. I don't know what to do with that. I keep reacting out of that all the time. There's a place, there's a range of activity where you would want to be able to step back and observe yourself and understand what's going on. Get behind, get the legs under what's under that. Does that make sense? A little bit, yeah. Okay. So again, I want to, as we start to come into the last 10 minutes or so of the evening, I'd love to hear from some more of you this evening. Chat in, if you will. Any questions you have? Any comments? Is there any aspect of this topic that you want to explore further, or is there another topic that you'd like to open up? If we don't get to it tonight, if you put something in the chat, we don't get to it tonight, we'll definitely consider it for one of our upcoming chats. We get a lot of our best content from folks out there in the audience asking us, hey, let's talk about this. What do you think about that? Character is, I think, one of the things that I go back to conversations I've had with my son and some others in that millennial category, that population, that audience, if you will, which happens to be, by the way, quite a large number of folks who are watching my channel, which I found really interesting. It organically grew that this age group seems to be drawn to some of the things I'm talking about. And I think that plays out in itself. It sort of is very revealing to me, because I think this is a generation that many in this generation, and what's in that millennial group is, what are we looking at, 25 to 32?
Something like that.
Some 35 to 32, 35, I don't know the numbers. It's in that direction. It's in that area. I think there's a lot of things going on with that generation, with your generation, maybe if you're watching tonight. And one of the most disturbing things that I find is that, and it's the fault of my peers, too many of my peers have minimized or talked down at or to the millennials, saying, well, you didn't have, you had it too easy, or you didn't go through what I went through, so you're less than, or you're weak, or you're this or you're that. And I'm going to tell you what my experience has been, just the opposite. We don't, because my generation hasn't had your experiences, we don't appreciate the character building processes and events you had in your own lives. I found the older generation asking, how can you be stressed? You've had everything handed to you. Well, I can tell you, I know a lot of folks in this millennial group that have not had everything handed to them. And those that did have things handed to them and their character building maybe suffered. Well, whose fault's that? Who handed it to them? Okay. And this just reflects something here. I think this goes back to reflect the whole problem that I mentioned before. We lack a cultural system. We lack a process. We lack something that should be inherent and should be taught from day one, raising our kids with a certain set of character building traits, processes, and opportunities to test those traits and those processes in real time. Yeah.
I don't even think it's just character. I mean, we don't learn about money. We don't learn about what's important, and we don't learn about how to find the right relationship, and we don't learn any of these things. Is it because it's difficult, or because the older generation doesn't know, or because I mean, why do we only learn from books in our culture?
Well, that's a great question. Why do we try to learn from books? Because building the things that we're talking about here tonight in this chat, much of it is undervalued. I think much of it's undervalued. Building character, how to deal with the relationship. All of those, by the way, do fall back into even how to deal with money. Not just the how to make a good investment, but just conceptually, how does money work in my life? What's what's my relationship to money? What's my relationship to the opposite sex? So much of this we farm out because as parents, as guiding adults, whether you're 25 and you're guiding your 3-year-old, or you're 60 and you're guiding your 32-year-old, we don't take on those roles as mentors as we need to, and we don't have a consistent framework. We don't have a cultural framework to teach these things. What I'm trying to offer is a framework to do that, to teach not only these character traits, but to also develop this ability to have your own experiences and have that process in place to learn from. So I think what's happened too, I mean, we can look at how another whole conversation is, what's education been? Education it's gone from not growing people, balanced people, but it's growing consumers and producers. We've categorized ourselves in that way, and we raise our children that way, I think, all too often. Or we farm out, or we outsource character building. Well, that's the church's job, or that's the school's job, or that's somebody else's job. No, it's all of our jobs. The whole village, the whole tribe has to be raising the level of character. We have to be, but we all have to be on board. We have to begin with ourselves. We can get through life, muddle through life without this training, but to optimize our potential and to have optimum relationships, optimum interaction with others, we need to have a foundation. We need to have character building. So what are the folks asking me over there, Rob? I'm looking at the screen from here.
Just people saying thanks and glad to be here. And
yeah, I'm seeing Jen and Carla. Good evening. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining in with us tonight. I do want to remind you all, by the way, just to as we're starting to come into the last few moments here, I noticed a couple of you just said you arrived late. That's not a problem. These talks are live now. Of course, it's Sunday nights from 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but they are recorded and they're on the video playlist on my channel. You can go back to any and all of them and review them or see them for the first time. They'll be up tomorrow morning for you to watch. Please share these with your friends. I know 9 to 10 Eastern Standard Time might not be the optimum time for you here, but I'm having to think across the country, different time zones, trying to make something work for the greater good of the many. But go back to the playlist. We've got a couple from the previous weeks that we've done. I'd love to get back to those and comment. You can always comment on those and give us some. What I really like is you give us some topics that what do you guys want to talk about? What is a burning question you have, or what's something that you're trying to navigate in your lives? And when you chat those in, I don't have to advertise your name. I don't have to call you out on camera here for asking the questions, but I really want to find out what your loudest noise is, what your greatest obstacle in leading a balanced life. And if I can help in any way, I'd love to be able to do that. You can also go to my webpage. If you go to warnerhealingguidance.com, which you're guided to on the channel, you can get on my email list, and you get a nice in a text format for the 4-step path. You'll be able to see it there. You can also go to the to the channel itself and see the videos that pertain to the 4-step path and all the details of that. You get on my email list, you'll get regular blog posts, you'll get maybe some early views of some of the things I'm putting out on the channel as well, and ongoing free content. So, Rob, what parting shots do we have here? Anything?
I just want to continue on what you were saying, in that this channel is about the audience. This channel is not about you. It's certainly not about me. But
No.
what can we do to meet you where you're at? What can we do to help you work on those things?
Absolutely. This is about, what Rob's saying is absolutely true. I can sit here, and anybody who knows me realizes, yeah, he can sit here and talk forever. But I'm also trying to come up with topics to talk about that I'm getting feedback from you all on a regular basis. People are asking me this, and I take it and I bring it to the chat. This is about you. What do you need? I want to thank you for being here this evening. I want to remind you to keep looking to the channel, because every morning, Tuesday through Friday, at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have a fresh video out, a short video maybe to get your day started. And with that being said, have a great week, and until we meet again, good night.